That doesn't matter so much for you, but for anyone who's in the physical room that I am for the moment, you will be recorded if you if it's going while you speak, and obviously Phil, of course, too, will be recorded. Questions, though, will be run through the Q&A function. Please, we really encourage you to use that. As I said, there are up to 700, almost 700. I think Hel just gave the exact number on the chat. A lot of registrants, so putting questions through Q&A is going to be really important. If you put them in the chat, they may well get lost. However, the chat is for chatting. Please chat. Please have lots of side chats, social, around the topic, anything you fancy. We would love to see a lot of movement there. The timing for today is we'll start the seminar proper in a few moments. Then we will have run for, I think Phil's going to speak for about 40 minutes. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. Then I'm going to formally close off the proceedings. And after that formal close, we'll continue on with a Q&A as we need, probably for around another 15 minutes if there's interest. If there isn't, we'll just shut up shop right then. So that's kind of the housekeeping side of things. So before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the country on which we're gathered. So as we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place, and in doing so recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today, and feel free to put them in the chat. I'm on the land of the Kulin Nations today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. So I'd now like to introduce Professor Phil Dawson, and it gives me so much pleasure to say Professor Phil Dawson. I can't tell you, Phil and I have worked together for about a decade now, almost exactly, and it's been a fantastic partnership of research for me. So I'm so delighted to be introducing him. Now, Phil is Australia's, and possibly internationally, one of the best known public intellectuals on the topic of contract cheating. He also has enormous scholarship and research profile in the areas of feedback in higher education, and that intersection between the digital and assessment design, and I think increasingly around what you might call assessment security, is very much what Phil is known for. And I think no one else in the world, can I say, is doing the work that Phil is now. And I'd also like to give a shout out for his book, which was on the screen that I was going to read off, but has now gone. But I think, Phil, you have the title on your, there it is, Defending Assessment Security in a Digital World, Preventing E-Cheating and Supporting Academic Integrity in Higher Education. Fantastic book, highly recommended, easy to read, covers off the very big issues in a thoroughly intellectual but accessible fashion, which is, I think, a hallmark of Phil's work, and we will see some of that today. So without any further introduction, except, I do need to say you are also the Associate Director of CRADLE, which is where we all are literally, physically sitting today. Phil, over to you.
Wow, thanks so much, Margaret. It's always a delight being introduced by you, and it's been a wonderful decade of shared work. I've really enjoyed it, and many more to follow. So I guess I would first like to acknowledge that I'm not in the office space where my CRADLE colleagues are. I'm in my home studio in Armidale, which is on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to talk with you about the remote proctored exams dilemma. What's the dilemma? Well, Do we use this new thing? Do we resist it? Yeah, I'd say there's probably not been a more hotly contested topic over the pandemic with respect to assessment. So yeah, want to get into that with you today. I've got really three things that I want to cover off on. I want to talk about the pros and cons of remote proctored exams. Then I'm going to try and persuade you that really it's probably the perspective at which we come at this problem that ultimately shapes our decision much more than the evidence that I'm going to present you. I don't think any of us could claim to have the one true perspective on this. And then well, let's say we're in a position where we're going to use remote proctored exams and we might be very happy about that or very upset about that. How can we make the most of them while also minimizing their potential harms? And I'm going to do that from the assessment security perspective, which is the one that is in that book that Margaret so well touted. Okay, so that's our three things today. Firstly, I'm going to do the big disclaimer. And probably the biggest point of this is that I'm a standards-based assessment type of person. So there are some people in this debate who reject the notion of standards-based assessment. So what is that? It's the idea that we want to see what students have done and assess that against preset learning outcomes, things that we know in advance, and standards against those learning outcomes. In Australia, that's the dominant way of doing assessment, both in terms of what we are required to do by our regulator and also what's sort of in vogue in the sector. So that's where I come from. If you come from a perspective of, standards or preset learning outcomes are incompatible with education, then probably you're not going to want to do a remote proctored exam. So yeah, that's where I come from. I just want to sort of lay that out there. Secondly, that I support assessment for learning. That's the AFL. That is assessment for learning, not the other one, although go Tigers. That joke probably works with like only people from Victoria, so I'm sorry about that. That's a football joke. It's the only football joke I'll ever do, so we're past it now. The AI there is academic integrity. The notion that we want to take a positive values-based approach to support students to be able to work with integrity. So I do support that. And I think cheating is a symptom of broader problems. If you are coming here thinking cheating is all because of neoliberalism or students as consumers or large class sizes or some other social problem might be intractable, I'm with you, but that's not the levers that I can pull. That's not my space addressing those problems. But I agree with you, those are factors in cheating. Next, that universities have a responsibility to try to prevent and detect cheating. In Australia, that's something we're legally required to do, but I also think it's just an important thing to do anyway. Next, that I receive research funding from educational technology companies. Probably the biggest of those is Turnitin. These are my opinions, not Turnitin's opinions. And probably if you're not aware, I believe Turnitin acquired a remote proctoring company relatively recently. So, that's something. Academics should have to wear jackets that have the logos of their sponsors emblazoned on them, so we all know who pays for whose research. And you would see a small Turnitin logo on mine. And finally, that my mum helped me contract cheat in year 4. I had to do a poster. Mum helped me too much. Probably I should also mention my dad gave me a word to use in a story that I wrote in year 7. He added posthumously in there. It's a great word. My teacher said, "Oh, lovely word. What do you mean by that?" And I froze up. And that is like one of my worst educational moments ever. Probably along with all of this stuff, I'm also a dad, and my eldest son is sitting his NAPLAN today, which is our sort of high stakes standardized test that a child of only 8 has to sit. And gee, we've had some great conversations in our house around standards-based assessment. All right, that's the preamble all done. We're talking remote proctored exams today. What is a remote proctored exam? Here's what I mean when I say remote proctored exam. It's always an exam, it's always timed. So there's a time limit. It's on a student-provided computer. So if you're thinking something where the university has students in a lab, that's not what we're focused on today. We're focused on student-provided hardware at a location of the students, you choosing monitored or recorded by a person or computer remotely. Usually we also mean something where the student's computer is locked down, so certain features of the computer are not available. That might be you're not allowed to run other software, you're not allowed to browse the web, those sorts of lockdowns. Biometrics, you might be videoed during a remote proctored exam and your face might be compared with your face in a database. I'm not claiming here that all remote proctored exam companies do this, because some of them have very vigorously defended the position that they do not do that. So please note, I'm not saying they all do that. There's some sort of identity verification usually, so we know that the person sitting the exam is the person who's supposed to be sitting the exam. And they're also usually offered by a third-party provider. Most universities that use these have outsourced that. They haven't developed their own in-house thing, though there are some that have. So when I say remote proctored exam, I'm really focused on this. And there are just so many remote proctoring tools. I've got a link to this list here up on the e-assessment remote proctoring SIG. There are just so many of these. Don't take anything I say in this talk to apply to all of them or any one in particular, but a lot of what I'm going to say applies to a lot of these tools. It's also big and getting bigger. So in 2019, it was about a $354 million market. There's claims it'll be a $10 billion market by 2026, a compound annual growth rate of 17.4%. My gosh. If you believe in remote proctoring, and this is not investment advice, because I'd be the worst person to ask for investment advice, but gee, it seems like a sector that's growing. And we've got a quote from a remote proctored exam CEO company, CEO here. During the pandemic, they said, it's insanity. I shouldn't be happy. I know a lot of people aren't doing so well right now, but for us, I can't even explain it. We'll probably increase our value by 4 to 5 times just this year. So the pandemic, while it was very bad for a lot of things in higher education, for the remote proctoring sector, it was pretty good. They expanded quite a lot. That's a quote from the CEO that's then quoted inside this fantastic paper by Neil Selwyn and colleagues, which is a critical socio-technical view on remote proctored exams. And it really draws in some of the stuff that was in the media, some experiences of students, some experience of student advocates, of educators. It's a really great piece. And I sort of talk very briefly about the critical socio-technical view later. It's also a field that's not afraid of litigation. Up there on the left, you'll see a headline from Vice that an exam surveillance company is trying to silence critics with lawsuits. And on the right, you'll see Ian Linkletter's photo. Ian Linkletter is, at the last time I checked, and I haven't kept up to date with the case as of the past couple of days, being sued by a remote proctored exams company. I've donated to his GoFundMe. It's been quite an expensive process for him. I raise this both to say this is a potential issue with the remote proctoring space, but also to say that I will be somewhat guarded with the things that I say, because I don't want to get into trouble. That's about as precise as I can be. So yeah, this is a contentious sector. Now, it's also got a very polarized literature. I don't know if anyone saw the great XKCD types of scientific paper cartoon that he did recently. Well, I kind of doctored that up with types of remote proctoring paper. So here we've got, these are the sort of 6 types that I found on really reading the literature recently. We've got it's surveillance, and along with that usually goes, and surveillance is not a good thing in education. We next have students do worse when proctored, and from that we can infer that they cheat less when they do that. We've next got abandon exams and do authentic assessment instead. We've got proctoring is ableist, racist, cop shit. We've got students don't do worse when proctored, which means it's okay to proctor them because they won't do worse. Kind of clashes with the middle one in the top row. And then we've got trusting students as the solution. There's such contrasting perspectives here. It's really hard to make sense of it all. But I'm going to try really hard to do that. So now I'm going to try and go through the pros and cons of remote proctoring based on what I've seen in the literature. So I'll start with the pros. There is one pro. The pro is that remote proctoring might detect or deter cheating in online exams. You might be thinking, oh, but Phil, if students do remote proctored exams, they can sit exams in their own home, or they can have access to rich media or all these other things. Yeah, they can. But those are benefits of online exams. I'm focused on remote proctored exams. I'm going to really acknowledge that, yes, those other things about online exams are often really great. But we could have those without proctoring. We proctor because we want to detect or deter cheating. So I'm really going to focus this analysis of the evidence in favor of remote proctoring in terms of evidence that it detects or deters cheating, while acknowledging that remote proctoring might enable us to do exams at home, which comes with its own benefits. Okay, this is the big finding in the literature. If I could tell you one thing with a fair degree of confidence, it is this: students do worse in remote proctored exams versus unproctored online exams. Oh, and by the way, they also often complete proctored exams more quickly. And this stuff on the left is used to justify this claim on the right. Therefore, remote proctoring reduces cheating. And I've got a sample of 9 papers from the literature that have that finding, with pretty similar study designs where students sit proctored exam or unproctored exam, usually in like a natural experiment type setup rather than a randomized control trial type setup. You know, we ran this course with proctoring, we ran this course without proctoring. Yeah, or this year we did it with proctoring, this year we did it without proctoring, that sort of thing. So I can tell you pretty confidently that students are probably going to do worse in remote proctored exams compared to unproctored online exams, and they'll probably do it more quickly. The inference that proctoring reduces cheating, I just don't buy that as something we could have complete confidence in. It's a maybe to me. There are other rival explanations. Maybe it's proctoring leads to anxiety or stress or some of the other cons that I'm going to talk about, and that those hinder academic performance in exams. To me, the jury's out on whether we can go from students do worse, therefore they must be cheating less. And I just want to acknowledge as well that there's a couple of studies that find students don't do worse. And what's really interesting is that this is also used as a rationale to justify the use of proctoring. I wonder what those people would be like if they got in the same room as each other. My study shows proctoring leads to worse grades, therefore it's good. Well, my study shows proctoring doesn't lead to worse grades, therefore it's good. I don't know how that conversation goes. Now, if I were to pick one study to represent as probably the best evidence in favor of remote proctoring, it would be this one. It's a 2016 study. It used an experimental design with randomization. So, students were assigned to either the proctoring or the non-proctoring condition. They sat the exam. It has the students did worse and took less time in the proctored condition result. And they did say this could very likely be a result of less cheating. But they also say there could be some rival explanations for this. And they go through a few of them. I believe they're the obvious ones that I talked about before. But in addition to that, they used a previously validated instrument that they surveyed students with And the students indicated that there was significantly less opportunity to collaborate in the proctored condition. And this is in a test design where collaboration is not allowed. Significantly less opportunity to utilize unauthorized resources. So, if it's a closed book exam, significantly less opportunity to use your notes. And significantly greater deterrence to engage in misconduct. To me, this is probably, if you're in favor of remote proctored exams, this is your go-to study to try and justify that point. But what are we missing? We're missing peer-reviewed evidence that proctoring detects cheating. Before, I was talking about largely deterrence, and that survey sort of is a lot of deterrence stuff. But what about the detecting of cheating? Well, we kind of don't have any peer-reviewed evidence of that. I have been in conversations with several remote proctoring companies. I've got really an open invitation if you're, and I believe we do have some people from remote proctoring companies here, if you want to do a study where we try and find out if it's possible to cheat in remote proctoring, if remote proctoring really does detect cheating, I'd love to do that with you. I have a proviso that we publish out of that because I wouldn't want to do a study we find that proctoring doesn't detect cheating and then we keep that result secret. That feels kind of unethical. But really flexible beyond that proviso in terms of how we try and explore this really interesting problem. In the absence of some really robust evidence about this, we've got things like the top right, which is a quote that apparently was on a remote proctoring company's website until fairly recently. It's still on their LinkedIn bio, which is using state-of-the-art technology and end-to-end data security, proctoring company name, ensures the total learning integrity of every assessment every time. Our software eliminates human error, bias, and much of the expense associated with remote proctoring and identity verification. Those, to me, sound like sort of empirical claims that we could do a great study around. On the bottom right, we've got just one example of the many out there where here is a security researcher. Riley Chase is great. I've had some great interactions with him on Twitter. There's some people who aren't so great that also try and do what he's done. Riley found that he could cheat inside a couple of different remote proctoring products just by firing them up in a virtual machine. Riley contacted the vendors about that, and you can go read the blog to see sort of what happened after that. But we've got this thing where we've got vendor claims and then what some people are saying they've been able to do. And then if you use remote proctored exams, talk to your IT people at your university, ask them, did they have a go at cheating? Who do we trust? We need some independent peer-reviewed research here. Okay, so in summary, I've got this sort of evidence in support of the pros of remote proctoring. Here's the pros. Remote proctoring might deter cheating. We've got one high-quality study in support of that and many low-quality studies. And I'm not saying the studies were bad. I'm saying the inferences made from the studies, they just don't seem valid to me in terms of having quality evidence to support it. Just moving myself for my asterisks. And on the right, we've got, sorry, the bottom right, we've got the remote proctoring as a way of detecting cheating. We've currently got sort of promises from companies versus rumor, how-tos by cheating students and things security researchers have tried. We got a bit of an evidence hole there that I'd love us to be able to address. Now, the asterisk there, the first one, is this is the evidence that I'm aware of. And if you know of other evidence, please send it to me. I probably won't get to read all the chat today. If you can tweet it at me, email it to me, anything. I'd really love to see anything, especially things that'll refute the things that I've said. And yeah, I've mentioned that they're low quality studies in terms of supporting that inference. Okay, that's the pros of remote proctoring. Now, the cons. I've got cons or concerns here of remote proctoring that are expressed in the literature. On sort of going through it, I found 5 key ones. Firstly, that proctoring, it's surveillance or it's an invasion of privacy, that it leads to pressure, tension, discomfort, or anxiety for students, that it establishes a culture of distrust, that it's racist, ableist, or in some other way discriminatory, and that it supports exams, and exams are bad, as claimed in this literature. Okay, the first one. Privacy and surveillance. Now, me personally, I don't like being videoed. I love this right here. I've got great control over this. I'm prepared, but I don't want you to watch me while I try and do an exam. I really wouldn't like that. That's my personal view. And some students share those concerns. There's been a few studies there now that have looked at that. Not all students do. And you'll see that quote on the right, which was from a student during the pandemic. I don't really have a lot of concerns in respect to privacy. People sitting there saying, oh, I'm not giving my information. Oh, it's just creepy. These are the same sorts of students that say coronavirus is a hoax. Opposition to proctoring goes hand in hand with that. I don't agree with this student. I think there are legitimate queries, concerns some students have made with respect to privacy in remote proctored exams. And I think it's not the same as being some sort of coronavirus conspiracy theorist, but there's students at the extremes of both sides of this. Now, there's also, sort of to delve into the privacy issues more specifically, there's this great paper by Langenfeld, which talks about the specific ways that it might have privacy issues. So there's compliance with legislation, especially in Europe with the GDPR. There have been some countries that have had really fierce debates about it and even decided, no, this remote proctoring is not compatible with our view of privacy. Use of personal information, the secure data transfer. In, say, Australia's privacy policies, we've got things around trans-border data flow. There's specific rules where data goes across borders. There's use of data forensics and storage of that data. And then there's, the real capital S surveillance, the surveillance studies view on proctoring, often using Lyon's ideas around surveillance culture. I think those are quite interesting. Sean Baines et al.'s Manifesto for Online Teaching has a really, really good chapter in there that takes quite a negative view on technologies like this, not remote proctoring especially, but technologies like text matching tools, etc. I've got a chapter in my book where I discuss surveillance culture as well. The interesting difference with surveillance culture is it's a very participatory thing for students. They're a part of it. They sometimes even pro it. There's a worry perhaps that active engagement in surveillance of proctoring might normalise surveillance for these students in their postgraduate lives, the graduate lives, when they're out there in the world, they might be more okay with surveillance. And is that something we want to promote? There's the pressure, tension, discomfort, and anxiety angle. There's really just limited evidence on this. It's one of those frustrating things, I don't know about you, but for me as a scholar, you see a claim and you follow the reference, and then you've got to follow their reference, and then you've got to follow their reference. And you go down many steps before you find that actually this isn't an empirical claim about remote proctored exams. This is something else. I'm yet to find anything really that nails this, that these are problems for a remote proctored exam. However, it makes a lot of logical sense to me that this could be an issue. And certainly there is reasonable evidence that students with a high trait test anxiety, so they're people who normally do find tests something anxiety-inducing, are more negatively impacted by proctoring. I believe that's in terms of their performance in the tasks. Okay. There's the idea of remote proctoring as distrust, that the use of proctoring just sets up, we don't trust you. We need to monitor the hell out of you. We need to surveil you. We are concerned you are going to cheat. And that's not a great place to start for educational assessment. There's a great reference there from Swagger about Sieber's idea of a pedagogy of distrust, and that remote proctored exams are that. And again, Bain et al.'s manifesto. If you're interested in trust, A lot of the remote proctoring literature doesn't engage with it, but David Carlis's great paper on trust, distrust, and their impact on assessment reform, I think could really inform us a lot, because it's about lots of different trust relationships in assessment, not just teacher-student. And then there's the idea that proctoring is racist, ableist, or discriminatory in some other way. My CRADLE colleagues know I've put the Bristol stool chart on my slides before, which has pictures of poo. Well, here we've got we. Because at the bottom left, you've got pictures of urine. In the bar exam, in some states in America, remote proctoring is used, and there was a big sort of media furor last year around it because some students weren't able to take a bathroom break, and they resorted to various means to address that. We have a whole bunch of these sorts of issues in the media. They are often echoes of arguments that are happening more broadly around things like policing and or artificial intelligence in general. And on the right, we've got, a quote that really represents that view. Further, students must endure the racist, ableist technology peddled by companies like Proctorio, ProctorU, and ExamSoft, which frames students' bodies as abnormal. Have dark skin, the racist technology cannot see you. Wear glasses, the ableist technology sees you, but it doesn't believe you are you because it can't detect your eyes. And that's from Logan. And here's another view that proctoring keeps exams going. I don't know about this one as being included in this talk. Most criticisms of exams do apply to remote proctored exams, but we're not going there, really. But, I was quoted in Times Higher Ed saying stuff along those lines that remote proctored exams have made it easier to keep doing roughly the same exams we've always done. And I worry this might get in the way of reimagining what assessment should be for the future, and that exams must not be an artificial life support system for a dying type of assessment, the invigilated exam. So yeah, I'm on record as having concerns in this space. All right, those cons, we just went through them. I think I want to say, compared to the pros, is that these are much more diverse and more challenging to establish empirically than the pros. It's hard to come to an empirical argument around something that ultimately is a moral or ethical sort of concern. So I'm going to jump to the perspective issue now, because really what we've got is the sort of a weird apples and oranges type comparison of, on the con side, concerns about privacy, surveillance, anxiety, distrust, discrimination, and the continuation of outmoded assessment practices. And on the pro side, evidence that proctoring probably deters cheating and claims that it is in or effective at detecting cheating. How do we even compare those things? That's really hard. And you might already have a diehard view on this, that no amount of further evidence in either column is really going to change that. Or if not you, I'm sure you know somebody who's like that. So my view is that how we frame the problem probably influences us more than the evidence. Now, when I planned to do this talk, I was on another computer where I've got a saved file with clever things to say about each one of these perspectives. But now you're going to get the proctored version of me without my notes, because I'm on a different computer without my notes. So there's a bunch of perspectives here. They are, to some extent, likely to side more in the pro or the con column. I have angled them, arranged them from probably the more okay with proctoring at the top to probably the least okay with proctoring at the bottom. People who subscribe to these views, I'm sure, would love me to reshuffle the list. I apologize about that. Okay, firstly, let's take the criminology view. Criminology, in this case, might be really interested in, say, the deterrent value of a real threat of getting caught. It might talk about things like we actually have some sort of a guardian here. We actually have some sort of monitoring here. We're actually able to enforce some sort of penalties, and that should shape student behavior. So if you're interested in those sorts of things, well, perhaps proctoring's kind of an effective or okay thing. Cybersecurity might say, Well, we've got a system here, an exam, and we want to ensure that it is handled in the way we want it to be handled, that people aren't going to be subverting the controls within the system. And from that view, well, it becomes a fairly empirical question about the effectiveness of those controls. But also cybersecurity's got this long history of, it's always a trade-off between sort of convenience or user experience and security. So are the user experience or convenience problems that big that they outweigh the security benefits? Very similar with assessment security. We want to look at the pros and cons here, the effectiveness of it. We want to get some empirical evidence that this thing works and is worth the potential harms. Academic integrity is a positive, values-based mission about inculcating certain capabilities, certain moral values in students. And people in the academic integrity world have very mixed views around remote proctored exams. There is certainly a body of work around distrust there, that remote proctored exams communicate distrust. They're not a positive academic integrity approach. A philosophy or artificial intelligence ethics perspective really goes into, computers as decision makers, our trust in computer systems, some quite sophisticated decision-making sort of discussion in that Coughlin paper that I've got referenced there, that's just up as a preprint at the moment, but is really worth a read, because it's probably the best version of the AI ethics as applied to remote proctoring. I've also got a chapter of that in my book. A critical socio-technical view, such as that put forward by Selwyn in that paper. We want to, through a critical socio-technical view, actually understand the everyday lived experience of people who use these sorts of things, the opinions of actual stakeholders out there that are engaged in this. A surveillance studies view, that proctoring is surveillance, and to me that's not a contentious thing, that surveillance might not be acceptable, that it might lead to certain other bad things happening to students, that, as I said before, it might normalize surveillance in broader society if it's what we do in the academy. And finally, a critical pedagogy view, which is to me sort of a body of scholars who are the most anti-proctoring. This work would really reject my idea that there might be pros and cons worth discussing, because these authors talk about how we need to be activist in our opposition to this, because the moral wrongs of this, the harms, cannot be justified by some sort of other benefits. We can't do some sort of fake objectivity in a discussion about this. So where you sit in your perspective, when you think about assessment, when you think about cheating, I think really shapes your decision much more than the pros and cons I discussed earlier. Now, I want to talk about academic integrity and assessment security as two particular perspectives that I think are pertinent to this. The briefest refresher on academic integrity, that it's about fundamental values of honesty, trust, fairness, respect, responsibility, and courage. That this is a positive values-based mission, that we want to develop these values in students, that developing these values in students while they're at university is associated with fewer professional integrity missteps when they're professionals, that these are valuable things. Now, to what extent does proctoring actually support that? To what extent does proctoring develop you as an honest person, or does it police you? To what extent does it engage you in sort of trust around your studies? This is complex. This is up for debate, and certainly there's no consensus from the academic integrity perspective. The assessment security perspective put forward in my book is really more of a hard-nosed perspective around taking measures to harden assessment against attempts to cheat, approaches to detect and evidence when there are attempts, as well as measures to make cheating more difficult. And I think this is probably the most generous view towards remote proctoring if we take just what's here. But an important thing from the assessment security perspective is that no single approach can be trusted. No single approach is perfect. If we expect remote proctoring to be perfect, it won't be, because nothing's perfect. There's no complete anti-cheating approach. This meme has aged a little bit. This is a Suez Canal, tiny little digger trying to make space for the ship that's stuck in the Suez Canal. And any anti-cheating approach is at best one digger trying to free up the canal. It's not everything. So assessment security is very much about layers of Swiss cheese. On the left there, we've got a sort of coronavirus-themed Swiss cheese model. On the right there, we've got Rundle, Curtis, and Clare's academic integrity-themed Swiss cheese model. These sorts of models are based on the idea that no single intervention will have perfect success. So nothing like remote proctoring will completely solve the problem of cheating, and we should never expect it to. We know masks don't stop the coronavirus entirely, but they're quite an effective intervention. So we have lots of these layers when we're dealing with the coronavirus. We need layers when dealing with cheating. Things that are anti-cheating approaches like remote proctoring may be a successful layer sometimes. They don't need to perfectly detect or perfectly deter cheating. So it's a balance, not a dichotomy between the trusting on the left and the securing on the right is the way I'd love us to think about this. And this is sort of the view that I try and take when I'm talking about cheating. So we want to balance the crime prevention, the trusting, educative, proactive, and the assessment securities detecting punitive, proactive or reactive approaches, the policing or surveillance. This might be distasteful to you. The very use of words like policing or surveillance might be anathema for education. And again, I just go back to the idea that it's our perspectives really that shape the remote proctoring debate much more than the evidence. But I think ideally, we want to do this difficult balancing of the positive academic integrity mission with the assurance of an assessment security approach. So I'm going to put to you that from an assessment security perspective, there's going to be some times when the pros outweigh the cons. It's going to be some times when we do want to use remote proctoring. It's not all the time, but it's going to be sometimes. So this is, if you were wondering what's Phil's view on the dilemma that he posed, this is Phil's view. It's a sometimes. Now, I got one more thing to go into, which is how we're going to make the most of remote proctored exams if we take that assessment security perspective. I developed a resource for our higher education regulator, Texa, around this. I encourage you to have a look at it. There's a little tiny URL link there, or you can Google the title or whatever. And so many people gave comments on this in development that you won't be able to read all their names before I jump onto the next slide. But these slides will be shared and they're in the document. This document comes from the point of view that if you were going to use remote proctored exams, how would you make the most of them and the least of the harms? It goes into 10 practice suggestions in quite a bit of detail. I'm going to go through them in less detail about how can we, if you have to use them or you want to use them, how can you make the most of them? And the number one thing that came through that really resonated with everyone on that list, I think, was that remote proctored exams are a last resort assessment type. They're not something to go to first. We need to explore our other tools we've got in the toolbox before we decide we have to use remote proctored exams. If it's possible to do some other form of assessment and have some confidence that, you know, cheating's not going to be a problem, great. The sorts of last resorts that people talked about were things like that an accrediting body mandates, although you can argue against those sometimes, and we need to do more of that. And also the assessment of lower level outcomes. It's really hard in a remote setting to assess the, you know, basic memorization, for want of better words, of content. We need to think whether we need to assess those things at a university level as much as we do. There are times when we do, and remote proctoring might be a useful thing to do. However, I have concerns. It's very easy to cheat in those sorts of scenarios when you are assessing low-level outcomes in a remote proctored exam. Secondly, that exam designs are sound assessments of learning. We should never proctor assessment for learning. It goes completely against our goals there. That the exam designs are sound as well. We need to get the exams to be reliable and valid before we consider cheating. Reliability and validity are like first order problems, and cheating's like a second or some later order problem. That we only use the minimal restrictions. If we can make this an open book exam, let's make it an open book exam. I've been doing some interviews with students recently, and will not spoil the great results out of that. But one thing, when we asked them about cheating in a remote proctored open book exam, there was a lot of, but how would you cheat? It's open book. That students are offered an alternative to it being proctored, maybe a take-home or maybe a locally proctored one. That equity, diversity, adversity, and accessibility are catered for. Not everyone has the technology. Not everyone is neurotypical in terms of what their eyes do. Not everyone can go 3 hours without a bathroom break. There's so much diversity out there we need to cater for. And we need to deeply think about that and talk with students. That providers pilot the remote proctored exams adequately before using them in assessment. There's so much room for disaster if we jump straight in. That a whole of institution approach is taken. It's not just something an individual academic can choose to implement. That's a recipe for disaster. We need everybody on board. We need the legal people. We need the assessment design people. We need the technology people. We need the academics. So many people. That regulatory requirements and standards are met. It's complex. This is a deep one to look at, as is governance, monitoring, QA, evaluation, and complaints. And finally, that staff and student capacity building and support are available and ongoing. Just having a one-off session prior to us getting going is not enough. So if you're interested in these 10, there's a lot more detail about them in that document up on the Texa site. So that's my 3 things that I was hoping to sort of make you aware of, convince you of: the pros and cons of remote proctoring, the fact that those pros and cons are probably outweighed by the perspective that we bring to it, and then if we want to make the most of the benefits, the least of the harms, there are some things that we might want to try. Thank you so much for watching this. I'll stop the screen share and hand over to Margaret.
Hello, am I back on? Yes, I am. Well, that was fabulous, Phil. I think you lived up to the my hype, at any rate, of it being accessible and very intellectual at the same time. So thank you so much for that that insight. And the chat, I know when you really can't do 2 things at once, but it's actually been absolutely wonderful to read the chat at the same time. So many thoughts about proctoring and exams, and about a whole range of other things really coming to the fore there. Just a reminder, please vote up the Q&A. We've got a few questions in there now, so it'd be great to have a few more. And I'm going to start off with a question of my own before I move to these, which is to ask, do you have an example of a situation where you think remote proctoring, like a concrete situation where you think remote proctoring is the way to go, or conversely isn't the way to go, maybe even as well too?
Oh, this is the difficult one. All right, let's say we have a first year anatomy course. Anatomy courses, and this is much more your domain, Margaret, than mine, but anatomy courses tend to have a lot of what the big solo taxonomy would call unistructural and multistructural knowledge. It's really important that as someone who might go on to be a healthcare professional, you know the names of all the parts of the body, and there's thousands of them. Such is the argument that's been communicated to me. It's really hard to establish if somebody does have that unistructural or multistructural knowledge if they can kind of look it up. It's really hard to do that in a take-home task that's not in some way supervised. However, there's alternative views on that perhaps their use of that knowledge later in the degree might be a way that we can see if they have it. We didn't need to proctor that first year exam. Maybe we could get rid of first year anatomy exams, is that view. So yeah, I don't know. I think it really rests in the disciplines. It's times when you need to know with certainty that someone did it themselves on a computer with certain tools. But as I said, we don't have certainty about that.
Fantastic. And that ties in a little bit with the next question, which is really the top two questions around what your views are on, one, what is your general view on in-person invigilated exams? And then following on from that, how does remote proctoring compare to in-person invigilation?
Okay, so my personal view on exams, I think we need to look at assessment security at a degree level. So we need to pick out the moments across a degree that really matter in terms of accrediting someone as having this degree. And then we need to secure those acts of assessment. Exams might be a useful way to secure those moments of assessment. And no, I'll go as strong and say they are for some of them, but so are perhaps Vivas, so are perhaps some sort of project work with an on-site supervisor who really sees the act of assessment as it's growing. I think we do too many exams in a lot of disciplines, but I also think we don't do enough in some disciplines, which is probably not going to make me popular. But we need to deploy them really carefully. I think there's probably little use of exams in first year. I think if I was in charge, I'd get rid of a lot of those. Oh, and there was, I think what you're saying is what the other part of the question, which was around in-person versus remote proctored. I mean, there's really sort of two levels there. There's the shift over to it being on a computer, and then there's the shift to it being remote proctoring. I don't think... Okay, so there's evidence from Tracy Bretagne and Rowena Harper's project that third-party cheating probably happens more in exams than it does in take-home assignments, which was a really surprising one to me. And there's caveats to that. It's worth looking at the original research. So in-person exams aren't perfect either. We've never had perfection. Cheating's been around for thousands of years. So we've got the issue there. The in-between step is it turning into an online exam, which has a whole bunch of interesting things like, you know, students typing versus writing. Students produce a different type of text when they type to when they handwrite, and a lot of students prefer to type. There's the use of rich media. You know, if you're in some sort of exam where you've got to look at pictures, you can zoom in. If you want to listen to things, you can listen to the things. There's a lot of other affordances of e-exams, but I think that's e-exams, not proctoring. And often we bundle it all in together. Thank
you. I've got Joe turning my mic on and off, so you might see me hesitate a little bit. Thanks so much, Joe. The next question is, it sort of almost runs to that a little bit, and it's I think the e-exam question might come in here a little bit too. Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between proctoring and the assessment of low-level outcomes? And Rowena Harper has also added her two bits worth saying. She's very keen for her thoughts, for your thoughts.
Fantastic. And huge shout out to Rowena and her work as well. That national project that she and Tracy did was absolutely fantastic. At cheatingandassessment.org or .edu.au or something, someone could put in the chat. So relationship between proctoring and lower level outcomes. If I ask you, if I say, I'm going to go into the other room and I'm not going to come in and look, I want you to write down the names of the capitals of all of the states in Northern America. You might be able to do that off the top of your head. Nope. And you're someone who I've thought might be able to. But anyway, if you can't do that, how am I to know that you're not going and looking it up? Now, that's sort of the use of proctoring. Lower level outcomes are ones that you can just Google. The thing about those first two levels on the big solo taxonomy is they're the Google levels. The next two levels are not the Google levels. So the next two levels are solving a problem. And if it's an original problem that's been posed just for this exam, then they're not so much things that I can go to a static resource and get. We still have the issue of, students going to sites like Chegg. Chegg, of course, being a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company that I'm not saying is a cheating site, but certainly some people have used Chegg for cheating. During exams, posting exam questions up on Chegg and getting the answer in real time. But that's like a next step above. The level 1, level 2 outcomes, if you're not watching somebody, you just don't have assurance that they've done it without the resources. And if it matters to you that they haven't cheated on it, then that's a problem.
Yeah, I actually think it is a real it's a real conundrum, and it just shows, I think, your discussion how all of these questions cannot be disentangled from issues of assessment design in all its glory in so many different ways. We've got 2 minutes left to go. There's still a few more questions. What I might do now is formally close off the presentation. Phil, I will have to tell you, you have to read the chat at some point. There's a lot of very, very interesting conversation in there. But I please stay online. Please continue to add your questions to the Q&A. Phil can't see the chat right now. So do add them to the Q&A. I'll continue to ask them for another 15 minutes at least. But I would like to formally thank Phil for a wonderful presentation, illuminating, and I think really raising the hard questions in a debate that will continue on for quite some period of time to come. And you are getting lots and lots of thanks and appreciation in the chat, and also, in the room I'm in, certainly smiles and nods as well too. So thanks again, Phil. Thanks to you all for coming. Next CRADLE seminar is, interestingly, on similar, very different topic, but sort of similar themes. And it's about programmatic assessment in postgraduate medical education, but the same sorts of themes of trust and distrust, of knowing when someone's doing something authentically or they're just putting on a show, etc. It's interesting to see how assessment runs the same sort of road in very different forms in different ways. Dr. Damien Castanelli will be giving that talk as well. So a little bit more of a relational view around trust. So hope to see you then. Thanks so much for coming, and everyone please stick around. So I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to keep on going on to the next question, having done that formal close. And this is kind of a comment, I think, but I'll read it to you, Phil, and get your response. It seems that it's from Kylie Day. It seems that in-person exams are seen differently to remote supervision by a person, AI only aside. The whole point of holding exams is to ensure ID management and control of the exam conditions. Then online proctoring can do a much better job than typical exam supervisor. Online exams are a second-order change and require a rethink of the design of assessments that are appropriate, as well as a rethink of why we hold exams, but can be used for good instead of evil. And you were talking about that middle layer between the online exam. Do you want to expand on that, on how thinking about online exams changes that balance, the pros cons issue, Phil?
Yeah. So I guess I'd sort of refer to work by, say, Matthew Hillier and his colleagues. They've done some good work to establish what the pros of using computers in exams might be. And yeah, I'm someone who sat a computer science degree using pen and paper, which seems absolutely ludicrous. That's completely inauthentic to the way that a computer scientist does their work. And it's also, in my view, very low validity assessment. It doesn't really tell what I'm capable of as a computer scientist, getting me to use pen and paper. So yeah, I think the move from paper to computer, good move. The proctoring component, though, I guess it just comes with so many other complications. Firstly, we've got the sort of social acceptance of the current mode of face-to-face proctoring. It's something we almost don't question very much. Yeah, but as I said in the talk, my son today was proctored as an 8-year-old, colouring in those little circles on the paper. And that component of it is not something we even talked about in our house. We talked about all the other issues with the test, but not the proctoring. So I think, yeah, we accept the face-to-face proctoring. There's a whole bunch of really big arguments against the online proctoring that are online specific issues. And, I believe somebody in one of those questions might have mentioned the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and they're an organisation, sort of a public interest law firm out of the States. And they've raised a lot of concerns about remote proctoring in terms of, similar things to your problems people have with Facebook or Google or other big tech companies. And remote proctoring brings a lot of that into it. So I think it's complex. And I also am not sure about the actual effectiveness of it at doing the job it's supposed to do.
So another couple of questions. You can probably read them now yourself, Phil, but I'll read them anyways. From Philippa Levy. Thanks so much, Phil. That was great. What is your advice on whether proctored exams are best closed book resource or open book resource? A debate for us at the moment. And that leads on a little bit from the complexity, this intersection, as we keep on talking about, between what you're doing and whether proctoring's right.
Yeah. So it's kind of a difficult one, because earlier I said, proctoring might be a useful thing when you're dealing with lower level outcomes. But the problem is, that goes along with that, proctoring is not very good at securing those lower level outcomes. I don't give cheating how-tos. That's not my vibe, although I have written a paper with the title 5 Ways to Hack and Cheat in, and then a type of assessment, which if you Google one of the vendors, how to cheat in, and then a vendor name, you get that paper as your top hit. It totally blew up on my academia.edu. But with the lower level outcomes, I still reckon if I chuck a clear screen protector on my screen and have my notes written up on that, you're going to struggle to find it. And that's like the most low-tech thing. The other one is, I've got a webcam here. I'm not going to pick it up for the worry of breaking things. A lot of these things require you to scan your room to show things. Well, what I do is I stick my cheat notes to the back of the webcam, and then I can pick up the webcam and move it around, and you'll never see my webcam. Now, those are the really low-tech things. I've also got a bunch of cheating hardware here. I've got a device that tells the computer it's a USB keyboard, but actually isn't a USB keyboard. It's a computer that types things into the computer when I want it to. So I can have that device very convincingly type in my exam for me. So there's sort of no tech all the way through to some pretty sophisticated ways that we can get at the lower level outcomes. So because of all of that, I reckon open book, open resource is probably the best way to go, because we can't secure those resources. We just can't do that effectively.
Thanks, Phil. And I think that also comes back to your comment about the Swiss cheese model and all the multiple things we need to do. And I think I do think the point about the collective social responsibility is a really interesting one, and one that's not discussed enough. And following on from things that aren't discussed enough, Rowan has asked another question / comment. Phil, what do you think the next important research areas are in this space? What research questions should we be asking?
Okay, so I I think we've still got the unanswered stuff about the efficacy of remote proctoring. So I'd really like to see that really looked at, and I'd love industry to come hand in hand with us. And when I said before that we got to publish if we find that there are problems, I'm not saying we go tell the world how to exploit your product on day one. I'm saying we try and address it and fix it and then share what the vulnerabilities used to be. That's my ideal thing. We fix this, we make this thing better. So we've got those sorts of issues. We've then got, I think, the sort of more AI coming into it. So in AI, we've got these Turing test type things where we try to build a computer that's going to be indistinguishable from a human in some way. And, that's your classic AI story thing. Well, one of the Turing tests we have is the robot college student test. And the robot college student test is about, can we build an AI that in and of itself can fulfill all the requirements of getting a degree? Now, that's a great AI problem to have and really interesting from an AI perspective and terrible from a cheating perspective, because it basically says, let's build the cheating machine. But it raises this question of, to what extent do we allow students to use these tools? And in the book that you were the lead editor on, Margaret, I've got that chapter in there about cognitive offloading. That's the Reimagining University Assessment in a Digital World book. And in that cognitive offloading chapter, I really go into, well, if technology is eventually going to be able to do all of these things, where do we try and draw the line around what students should do? And you and Rose Luckin have another chapter in the book that addresses some similar ground. So I think some of the research we need to do is almost on that philosophy of education and work ground.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think that's just super interesting, interesting ground. And again, it just shows how this does not sit in isolation, but it intersects with all the other things that are happening to us. I think there's some great avenues forward there, Phil. And I mean, like, I think there was a comment in the chat about how you sat in some of those, in the blue to red graphic. So, I look forward to seeing more Dawson et al.'s on every single one of those layers, because I think they also represent areas where there's ways in to go. There are a few more questions in here. Daniel Lowton asked the question, but I actually think it's well answered in the chat. So unless someone else wants to answer that, then they can come to that. Mari Tour has asked, do you know if the top universities and top business schools are using proctoring exams? Proctoring exams.
Look, it's I guess that firstly, top is such a contentious thing. And I think there's some elite institutions that use them, definitely. And there's also some top teaching and learning institutions that use them. So yes, the answer, regardless of how you think of top, is yes. But there's also been some institutions that have rejected them very publicly, that have resisted them. And there's some great work, it might be Shia Swaga or someone else, in the Hybrid Pedagogy Journal, I think, about refusal. And there have been some top level institutions that have had effective refusal campaigns as well. So it's a real mixed bag.
Interesting. A few more questions and then I think we will wind up. So one here from, I think, Alanietta Masuma Fatiaki. Apologies for your mispronunciation. How do you handle striking a balance, handling the dilemma between accreditation, invigilation requirements versus the privacy concerns for students?
And I think this is the big question. So I love this question. Really, by doing proctoring or doing other invasive assessment security interventions, which I would include in-person exams in there, we balance it by doing those things only as much as we have to do them. And that's probably a lot less than we currently do them, but really targeted at the moments where we need to know for sure. Those might be some of the final assessment moments rather than some of the first ones. So being very, very targeted.
A question from David B, who I think is possibly David Bowd. No, it is not David Bowd, which is good, because I was thinking it's an odd question for David Bowd to be asking. And it is, what are your thoughts on proxy test takers in a remote invigilation setting?
Well, one of the studies that I'd love to run is actually paying some of those proxy test takers and seeing if they can sit remote proctored exams, because such a study, to my knowledge, hasn't been done so far. So I sort of don't have anything empirical to say there. I can say that there are services out there that definitely claim to be able to sit remote proctored exams for you and not get caught and get you a great grade. Though some of the work out of CRADLE, led by Wendy Sutherland Smith, has found that promises of, say, contract cheating sites, we'll make you a great paper and we'll give it to you on time and all these things, that those promises are often not delivered upon. So I don't know to what extent these services that offer proxy test takers are real and reliable or easy to detect, and would love to do such a study.
Yeah, it's a great curiosity to me. I mean, I do think that we have so many proxy test takers already out there doing ordinary exams as well. So I think that's always been an interesting one for me. I think we've got a few more questions. We actually got quite a bit. They're coming up a little bit more now. But I think that, Phil, how do you want to continue? Do you want to keep on going for a bit more? Do you want to close it off now?
Look, I guess I really would love people to feel free to leave. There's no compulsion to stick around. I'm not going to be offended at all if you go. But if possible, I would love to just maybe stick around till past, or when we get to the point where we don't have any further questions.
Well, we still have 196 participants online, so I think it's really worth continuing to ask, because that's still a lot of people. So why don't we go, say, for another 10 minutes and then sort of close things up? How does that sound? All right. So Yuso asks, lately there's been an interesting rise of student partnership literature and assessment research. I guess this connects with the academic integrity approach. Students have an opportunity to enhance their assessment and feedback literacies by contributing to assessment design. Trust is fostered by it, and etc. How do you position assessment security in relation to this work? Could students participate in making assessments secure, or should these approaches be kept apart? What role do students have to play?
Oh, I think students, so definitely there's, as you say, there's a strong presence of students in the academic integrity literature, and students are often presenters at the big academic integrity conferences. It's wonderful. As far as assessment security goes, I would love to do student partnership work. One of the ideas that we sort of were spitballing around ultimately to try and get this remote proctored exams cheating project going was to actually get some students to try and do the cheating, to work with us. And I know, like, I'm someone who was a cybersecurity undergraduate student. I would have jumped at that opportunity. I know there are a lot of students who are really keen to do that. And if we look at, say, the Finland exam board and their software they use, they even go as far as holding hacking competitions to try and get students to break their thing. So, and Yuso being Finnish might know that one. The reference I'm doing there is possibly a little bit old. It was from some software they were building out a few years back. But I think, I think there is definitely a role for students in helping us. As much as this is a thing where we are trying to stop students from cheating, we're not trying to stop most students from cheating, because they were never going to cheat in the first case. So that body of students are actually, a lot of them are actually quite keen in partnering with us on this. So yeah, great partnership opportunities. Thanks for the question. It's something we should pursue further.
Yeah, I think students' views of fairness is really striking. You know, I've been doing some interviews myself, and to see that come into play. And this comes a little bit, I think, to the next question as well, which is, I think, comes to that sort of notion of the collective and how various bits of the sector see things. And this is, does respect for cultural norms invite differences in a remote proctoring approach? And I suppose cultural norms could be read there in any kind of way. Question from Lewis Hughes.
Oh, that's a really interesting one. So, yeah, certainly, I think cultural norms and attitudes around cheating really vary. They also vary over time. So in addition to across cultures, they vary across time. Things that we now view as cheating were not viewed as cheating a long time ago. And in my book, I say, if you were to run everything I produced at university through all the current assessment security products, I may very well be found as a cheater, as probably, I would guess, the people sharing that table with you, Margaret, because we didn't go through when this stuff was big. So yeah, I think it does change over time. In the book, I also talk about in the game studies literature how technology, the developers decide what cheating is and what cheating isn't in computer games. And the players might not agree with that, but the technologists have kind of decided this is cheating and this isn't cheating. And people who play those games in all sorts of different cultures around the world have to put up with whatever the developer said was cheating. Now, remote proctored exams vendors are very quick to come in and say, we don't detect cheating. We don't say what cheating is and isn't. We just flag anomalies or those sorts of things. But to an extent, what they flag is brought out by the sort of cultural backgrounds of the people that are around the table at design time.
I think it's such a good point. And, you know, it comes to that issue that when, at any point, I suppose, when software is used, and increasingly with the AI techniques, is that a bunch of people around the room who may not be us, and we're talking about introducing the student voice, and may not even be an academic voice and making some of those determinations. It might be the experience that they had once a long time ago that informs those choices. Question from Lincoln James. What would you say to academics, parents, students, others whose answer is always to always do the exam or have an exam? What tip might you have for encouraging them to question their assumptions? So how do you take people from the seesaw being one way and build them back to that balance?
Yeah. So I can understand there are a lot of reasons why people use exams. The stated reason is often, you know, we use exams because we can be sure the person is who they say they are and they're doing them under the conditions that we set. But in reality, there's a lot of other reasons why we use exams as well to satisfy professional accrediting bodies. We might use them because we have somehow ended up in a situation where exams are a feedback-free zone, and feedback's time-consuming. A lot of exams are efficient to mark. So there's a lot of factors there in the why do we use exams space. So I think addressing those, having the conversation around, well, exams don't really stop all the cheating in the way that you think they might be another piece of that. I mean, I'd also be remiss if I didn't point to the assessment design decisions framework led by Margaret and myself that actually goes through a series of sort of decision points, prompts around how you might decide to use one task or another. And, you know, I brought back to that project and an interview that I was sitting in, about 8 years ago with a couple of academics, and I said to them, oh, so did you ever think about not using an exam? And it was like, they're like, no, whoa, no, we never, it was unthinkable. It wasn't there. So perhaps some of the first prompting might be, have you thought about something else?
And what was I remember reading the transcript of that interview, and it was quite extraordinary because the science academics were like it wasn't like even a rejection of the notion. It was just inconceivable. It's inconceivable they could not have an exam. Has the security of answers to exam questions been looked at by SWARM? Where are the answers kept? Where are the videos kept? I have lecturers who have concerns that student answers are reliant on workplace knowledge that, for example, may breach government security.
Yeah, so, I mean, that would really be something to look into the agreements that are made with a particular provider. And I know that when you say things about this industry and providers in that sort of space that are wrong publicly, they get quite annoyed. So I would really look into what's the policy say around this for this provider? Is it something they keep locally? Do they let you have a copy of it at your institution? Do they let you run any of the stuff out of your institution? Does any of it exist on the student's computer? Where does it go? I think it's a really worthwhile question. The other one is, if we have questions that we're worried about sort of burning, using up, or even worse, leaking special knowledge, it is kind of possible to set up a room where you could monitor what's on the screen. That could be either through software on the screen, hidden cameras, loads of options to really be able to capture that. However, people have done that sort of thing just using their brains. There's a great history of brain dumps for professional certification exams where, say it's a Microsoft or Cisco or Oracle exam. After the exam, people go to a website, type in every question they can remember, and then those are sort of all compiled together. And eventually we've got the full test in public. So yeah, there are concerns definitely about the leaking of the questions.
I'm really mindful of time, and I thought that one of the questions I go to is one that was asked very early on by Daniel Lowton. I think it was the first question that was asked. So I feel like, as the front runner, you should, Daniel, get your question asked. And this is it. The Electronics Frontier Foundation has recently examined the validity of cheating in Canvas remotely proctored exams at Dartmouth Medical School and seems to have indicated issues in the code used to detect cheating, e.g. suspicious eye movements off screen and etc. Any thoughts on this?
So I'm not aware of that particular one, but I am aware of a blog which the EFF might have picked this up off. And the EFF are great, and disclosure, I've been an EFF member. I think we should do all we can to try and understand the inner workings of these. I believe with that particular case, it was that they were maybe using some public library that, and again, I haven't read this particular story, but using a public library that then researchers were able to look at how that library worked and then establish, oh, if they're using this, then it does this set of things. I mean, ideally, I've got the open source beard here. I'd love it if this stuff was an open source thing that we as a sector decided, yeah, look, all right, we're going to do this. Let's collaborate. Let's do it as an open source thing so we can all see how the inner workings are, where the data goes, how the data is handled, how the decision making happens. And if we think about sort of computers making decisions and those decisions actually holding up in human decision making processes, a court or an academic integrity panel or whatever, you kind of struggle a bit if you say, well, the computer said so. We need to be able to say, these are the steps the computer went on to be able to say so. And I think open source, or even just an open specification of the algorithms underneath, would allow us to do that.
That's kind of in stark contrast with the current commercial and confidence model, Phil. I think, will remain challenging. But I think that there's a lot to unpack in that sort of socio-political dimension as well. From I think the last couple of questions, I think I'll turn to this one for the very last question. How do we ensure security and integrity without compromising the support relationship between teacher and student, e.g. turning teacher into the police? Maybe that's a good final question.
Yeah. Oh, gee, it's a difficult one. I think we need to just, I've said this for a few of the questions, but we just need to do it less often. So most of the time, we don't need to have, your first year lecturer busting you for plagiarism because you just didn't know how it worked. That's a terrible scenario that sets up this horrible adversarial environment for students. They learn this is what university is. My teachers are just trying to catch me out. We're not trying to catch you out. We need to be developing you so you can operate in this environment. So we want to have more of our time spent on positive academic integrity, but we want to make sure we do the more adversarial assessment security mission at those points where it really matters.
Did that teacher ask you? Oh, sorry. Did that teacher ask you about posthumously in a nice way or a nasty way, Phil?
It was in the nicest possible way. I still remember her. She was a great teacher. She knew, and that's the thing, when you're reading student work sometimes, hey, I reckon they've gone awry in terms of integrity, but not in a terrible way. Let's have that conversation. So I will always be thankful to her.
So, I mean, I said that as kind of a jest, but also because I think there are ways to point these things out, as you're saying, that don't involve compromising the bonds that we have between teachers and students and those sorts of trusting relationships. Honestly, what a privilege to be able to ask you other people's questions, Phil. I thank you to all the question askers. They're absolutely amazing, and to everyone who's been really active on the chat as well too. I couldn't refer you enough to all of Phil's work. There's so much of it. I can see here. Rowena's mentioned cognitive offloading, such a useful concept. I'd refer you to Phil's chapter. Go chase up his work. It's super. And such generosity for spending 45 minutes on questions. Absolutely delightful. So thank you, Phil, on behalf of all of us. I learnt masses, and also I think I'm going to learn into the future when I'm going to turn off this and I'm going to go away and things are going to go into my head. So sustainable lecturing, Phil, what more could you want? Thanks very much, and thanks to all, and hopefully we'll see you at the next CRADLE seminar.
Thanks so much, everybody. I've had the best time, and thanks again to Margaret for the wonderful sharing and question asking. I've loved this.